Ja, wir kommen nun zu unserem nächsten Thema und das ist ein ganz wichtiges auch natürlich. Und zwar geht es da um die Gesundheit von Frauen. Denn das muss man klar sagen, die ist nach wie vor nicht so erforscht wie die von Männern. Das hat nicht nur ideelle, Beweggründe, beziehungsweise das hat nicht eine ideelle Auswirkung, sondern das hat natürlich auch ökonomische Auswirkungen und deswegen müssen wir da sehr, sehr dringend drüber sprechen. Ich freue mich sehr auf den Talk von meiner Kollegin Anke Myrrhe vom Tagesspiegel.
Yes, so welcome to our almost all-female panel, which is perfect because we are going to talk about women's health. Global Women's Health, Time to Reset the Dial is the title of our next panel. Why is the condition of women's health still worse than for men? And what is the impact of that? Socially, of course, and also economically. What can we do about it? That is, of course, the main question. And I'm very happy to welcome three very interesting guests today. Unfortunately, all on the screen, that's how it is these days, but I'm very happy to have you here. We have, first of all, Susanne Fiedler. She's Chief Commercial Officer at Organon, which is a global healthcare company. And Susie's goal is not less than achieving a healthier every day for every woman around the world. Wow, welcome, Susanne Fiedler. Second, we have Ilona Kickbusch. Ilona is known throughout the world for her expertise in global health and empowerment of women. She is the founding director and chair of Global Health Center and holds an honorary professorship here at the Charité here in Berlin. And The Lancet, that we all know now for pandemic reasons, profile her as a global health reformer. Welcome, Ilona Kickbusch.
Hello.
And last not least, our man of the day, Neil Datta. Neil has been the secretary of the European Parliament Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights since 2004. And he has worked in so many different constellations that there is no way of listing them all here. But luckily, we have a little time now to talk about your work and a lot more. I'm very happy to have you all on the screen. Thank you for joining our conversation and our discussion. We will jump right in. Susie, starting with you. On your company website, you say that a major part of your work is to ensure that Organon is a company that listens and learns from women. That sounds very basic. Can you explain to our spectators why that is still a major problem in women's health?
Yeah, thank you very much. And as you just heard, that our vision as Organon is to create a better and healthier every day for every woman. So we are truly unique because we're truly dedicated to women's health. And we started the company with a very strong footprint in reproductive health, in contraception and fertility. But since launch, we already expanded our footprint. We have acquired a medical device company focused on postpartum hemorrhage. We license an agent that is being studied in preterm labor. And we also acquired a company focused on endometriosis. And listening to women is really the starting point. We didn't just launch Organon as a company. We launched a commitment to listening to women because what we experienced really is that across the world, women tell us that their healthcare needs are just not being met, from contraception to fertility to endometriosis, menopausal symptoms, mental health, and many, many more. And certainly, if we now think about what we have experienced over the last 2 years with COVID has also amplified and highlighted the existing gaps in healthcare for women.
Yes. We're going to talk about the pandemic and the impact a little later. I want to come back to the healthcare, the general problem. Ilona, there's a lot of studies about women's access to healthcare. For example, that women always have to wait longer in emergency rooms. When, for example, they have belly aches or pains like that, because they are told from the start that pain is normal. yes, for women at least once a month, which is, as we know, not true. Can you explain why that is still such a problem?
Well, I think we have to start out from the fact that the medical gaze is still a male gaze. The normal body is the male body. So the normal person is the man. And therefore, a system that has to deal with the other, which is on the one hand women, but on the other hand also quite different genders as we are starting to experience. They are then the other, they are the exception to the rule, and they are not taken seriously. And we have a healthcare system that's been built by men, but that is staffed by women. So the decision makers are male in policy. Many of the researchers are male. I'm old enough to have been part of the women's health movement. And for us, it was just extraordinary how little the people who were deciding medically about women actually knew about women and their bodies. And in that whole context, and I'm sure Neil will be talking about that, it's not only a question of the gaze, it's a question of what you get and what your rights are. And therefore, the special needs of women are not considered, and the rights that women should have within the healthcare system are also not considered.
Yes, Neil, you've been working on a European basis for such a long time. How can we start? How can we achieve more attention and appreciation in on women's health?
Thank you. So, in fact, that's the core part of the work of my organization at EPF, European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. We work specifically with members of parliament, so political leaders, on the issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights, so contraception, maternal health, gender-based violence, the right to abortion, cervical cancer prevention. All of these are essentially women's health and women's rights related issues. And what we notice is that it's often not very high on the list of priorities of the political elites. And this is something that we need to change. We need to go from a situation where women's health is something nice that you do when you have a bit of extra money around, and then politicians can do something around this, to making it something of a real priority. We also need to see that dealing with women's health is not seen as a cost, but as an investment in society. And one of the ways that we do this is by comparing countries across each other, so that like this, in a certain area of policy, if you see that Germany is not doing as well as France, policymakers can start asking themselves questions. Why is my country falling behind in this area? And then you can at least raise some positive aspects of some innate patriotism that exists in many of us, in order to do better. And so we do this, for example, in the area of contraception, where tomorrow we'll be releasing our contraception policy atlas, and we'll be showing which countries are doing the best in Europe in terms of this very important area of health policy for women.
Oh, that's very interesting, Neil. Could you give us some examples? What's gonna be in that report?
Yeah, so we're releasing it tomorrow. Usually we try to coincide it with Valentine's Day, so as you know, like this is a positive association with contraception, and we all know what happens on Valentine's Day. This atlas, we take a look at 47 countries in Europe and what the governments are doing for making contraception available to their people, to the women in their countries. And so I won't say who the winners are for next. That will be revealed tomorrow. But I can say that already in the past few years of this atlas, a certain number of trends have emerged. So that, for example, an increasing number of countries, for example, Belgium and France, are making contraception freely available to young women under the age of 25. We also see that there's an increasing number of countries which are making long-acting reversible contraception more financially accessible to the people who need it most in their countries, which are younger women who don't have family plans for a couple of years, and who we all remember when we were younger, we didn't earn as much salary as we are now when we're a bit older. And so making it financially accessible overcomes a certain barrier. And so we see these types of trends evolving with the contraception atlas. But that's tune in tomorrow for that.
Okay, thank you. Susie, I know that you're a big fan of what's happening in France at the moment. Could you tell us more about what they do at the moment for women?
Yeah, so what Neil said is very important, that spending on women's health needs to not be seen as a cost, but as an investment. And we're seeing what progress can be made when governments listen to women and also recognize the economic value of investing in their health. So besides that, free access to contraception below the age of 25 for women, France government has also expanded access to fertility treatment for single women and lesbian couples just recently. And just last month, France launched a strategy to tackle endometriosis, which is one of the most underdiagnosed, under-researched, and misunderstood conditions in women's health. It affects 1 in 10 women of reproductive age, and it can cause severe pain and has a negative impact on women's relationships, their education, their professional lives, and their fertility. So here's also this economic aspect of investing in women. Very obvious, and France has really tackled that issue from 3 different dimensions.
If I may just say something
yes, of
here,
course.
I think, these points are incredibly important to make contraception available to women, to make sure they don't have extra costs, etc. But we're always in this really, really difficult position that many of these issues like contraception are then seen as women's responsibility. And therefore, I've been so happy that Neil is on this panel, because one of the key things around women's health is that men take their own health and their own responsibility seriously, and that they are supporters of women's health. So we always have to find the right balance between empowering women in every way that we can, particularly young women, but we mustn't let young men off the hook. I think that is incredibly important.
What could men do? I would say in a social relationship, how could they, like basic things they could do to help women?
I think Neil should answer that.
Go for it.
Well, thank you. Some basic things that men can do is, first of all, be an ally to women's causes. This is, and this all that it really requires is empathy, understanding that what women have to go through is a different experience than men. When it comes to women's health, understanding that there's a big part of women's health which is quite singularly politicized in a way that men's health and men's bodies simply aren't. And so understanding already, showing that type of empathy and understanding this is one specific area. And then this can be translated into taking action at a more political level. These women's health issues are not always given the high priority that they deserve. It's very exceptional that they are. France is an excellent example of that taking place. But France right now is an outlier. We need to build upon the French leadership in order to get other countries to follow suit. But I think already making this showing empathy that women have a different experience, and based on that empathy, demonstrating allyship with women's health and women's rights issues. Another area that requires this is also the whole issue of gender-based violence, where this is something that should be a no-brainer. Everyone should be against gender-based violence, but there's been big campaigns against legal instruments to protect women from gender-based violence. And I think that's something we really need to counter and denounce very forcefully, and that it's never acceptable to allow for gender-based violence.
Yes, Susie, would you like to add something?
Yes, actually, for me, coming back to the question, what men can do, I think it really starts with awareness that very often women deprioritize their own health. They are caregivers for the family. They take care of the family first. That has been really amplified by COVID. It starts by really listening to women and what specific needs they have so that their voices are heard. And it's also important to ensure and enable the focus on health for women. So what we as a company, for example, have decided to do on March 8th, when there is the International Women's Day, we will give our 9,500 employees a day off to make them focus on their own health, to make commitments to their health and to the health of the women around them.
I think Neil's point about the politics is very, very important, because most parliaments still also have a majority of men. Many political decision makers, also ministers of health, are male. And I do think, that men who can who have the power to take political decisions have to support women's rights, first of all, which is a broad set of rights, have to ensure that women are part of setting the agendas, that their voice is heard, and that they have recognition and status. And that also means that they are recognized in terms of the amount of money they are paid for their work. And we know that in practically all European countries, care work, nursing, social work, which is done by over 70% by women, is totally underpaid. And we have seen now during the pandemic that women have stopped this work. They have borne the brunt of the pandemic at home and at work, and they have not been paid. They have been made promises that they would get better pay, but now it seems there is no money for that. And so I think male politicians had better get their act together to really make sure that women are seen as citizens and workers with the same rights that men have.
But how come that even if women get to, it's a huge question to get more women, of course, to leadership roles in the society. But I read the other day that even if we get them there, they still do the major part of the care work. Why is that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would answer that we live in a system that is a patriarchy, and we are very, very slowly moving out of that. And we are continuously confronted with rollbacks. Women have regularly created movements that we get more equity in many different areas of life. But the minute there is a crisis, what we see is that we fall back into previous times. And this division of labor, which is, a defining factor of a patriarchy, that women do certain jobs, that these jobs are worth less, that they are paid less, that is a clear signal. And that can only be responded to with laws, with regulation, and with very strong voices, not only from women. I wish many more men were supportive of these issues, but that is difficult in a system where you are fearful that if you give women more power, you would lose it yourself. And that is one of the conflicts that we are experiencing also again now. And of course, also experiencing politically. Neil spoke about the progress on contraception. I tell you, a number of European countries, we're having a roll back on women's health with less rights because we have authoritarian and religiously driven politics in those countries.
Speaking of rollbacks, Neil, you've done a lot of research also on rollbacks in the EU. Could you tell us more about your results?
Maybe I'd just like to comment very quickly on on the important point that Ilona made. One thing also to keep in mind in terms of the patriarchal nature of society is that the inequities in gender relations compound each other, so that the gender pay gap, where women earn less than men on average. This plays out also in a family setting where under stress, where one of the couple has to make compromises in order to take care of the children, usually the pressure will be on the lesser earning member of the couple. And then that happens to be the woman. And so we can see then that the economics plays in with traditional roles of society, and then that then compound to put extra pressure on women in a way it doesn't exist for men. Now, in relation to the rollbacks, I think that's something interesting to take a look at. One thing is that when it comes to women's rights and women's health, and especially in the areas of sexuality and reproduction, there has always been a religiously inspired social conservatism, going back all the way many, many, many decades. What we're confronted with today is a new phenomenon, which is a new way for the extreme right to become to mobilize. And so that's why we see that in terms of the recent descent towards anti-democracy or de-democratization, positions against women's rights form an important ingredient there. And so I think that's something we need to recognize. It's not just the same old anti-women stuff that we've known for decades. This is a new phenomenon which is linked to de-democratization in society. And related to this is that this is not just a normative policy objective to restrict women's access to abortion or contraception. There's also a political agenda to reshape a political system on less democratic norms. And so I think once we realize this, then we can have a better understanding of the issue that we're dealing with.
Yes, of course. Susie, your company is doing a lot of work for that. Could you tell us how you can react on such a on that?
So I think what's very important is also sometimes it's more unconscious bias also going on, that women are unconsciously maybe regarded, when it comes to women in leadership roles, as maybe being not as decisive or as capable as men. So I think if I can talk now from a company perspective, what's really important is to have very clear objectives and targets and follow them and really pursue them very sincerely. And for us as a company, as Organon, it really started with how the composition is of our executive leadership team and our board. And for example, in the board, we have a female representation of 70%, which is the highest of any S&P 500 company. This has been done very purposefully, and we have really very clear objectives on all levels of the organization where we can ensure a diversity, because this is also, when you have a diverse team, when you have diverse opinions being heard and embraced, you come up with better solutions. And I also think when it comes to governments and country politics, what we need to continue to emphasize is the economic value of gender equality and equality in access to health, because when we invest in women, we all rise.
Do you have? That's very interesting that you have 70% of women. Could you talk more about that? What does that change, maybe in the being together and the working together? Is there any objection, for example, by men or even women?
So this is in the board, and in our executive leadership team, we have about 60% of women, and I've always experienced that throughout my career, that this diversity creates a different dynamic in discussions, very different, and it certainly leads to the fact that more balanced views, the voices are heard more equally, and at the end of the day, this leads to high performance for a company. There are many, many studies proving that. So, but this is not coming if you don't pay attention to it, if you don't focus on it, if you don't have specific targets and make conscious choices, it's not naturally happening.
Yeah. Ilona, that's a major part of your work too, like the empowerment to get women there. Where do you start? Like, is that something you have to start in schools maybe already, or even with smaller kids?
Well, obviously you have to start everywhere because, you know, it's what you experience in your family between your mother and your father. It's what you see in school if you're only taught by women, or, you know, if the boys are listened to and you're told you can't be good in mathematics because you're a girl. So it happens everywhere. I mean, that's the structural dimension of this. But then, of course, what has happened over decades again and again is to have initiatives and movements by women for their rights. And it's, you know, as somebody who in the 70s and 80s was very active here, we actually thought initially, well, we've really made a step forward. And then, you know, we looked around in the 2000s and we said, my gosh, you know, every time you go to a health panel, it's full of men. Every time you look at a leader of a hospital, it's a man. Every virologist you heard at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic was a man. So we thought, you know, what's really changed? And therefore you can see that over the last years, a number of new initiatives have sprung up. I've been part of Women in Global Health that has chapters all around the world, also one in Germany. But there are other initiatives like Women Lift. Melinda Gates has started a big initiative. So there is many such initiatives around now, which also focus on the issue of women in the healthcare system. We've had a focus, as you started also, about women's health. You know, are women healthier? What health rights do they need? Absolutely important. But we're starting to focus more on women as healthcare workers, as their rights, as the people who keep that system running, but who are severely discriminated against within that system. And this is where one is trying to have these glass ceiling discussions also, because yes, once a place, be it a hospital, a company, a school, a family, is run with more diversity, it usually is more productive, it's usually a nicer place to be. And what we finally want is well-being. We want societies in which people can live a good life, in which both women and men have a future and can live together equally.
You've been talking about the pandemic already. Is that how big is the step back we made, because women were didn't have the time or less time than men, as we know, to take care of themselves? Is that a major step back in women's health?
It's been major. There have been studies in many countries, and it applies to Germany, it applies to Britain, the United States, and it applies to a point that Neil, of course, made, saying, you know, that the person who earns less then, you know, leaves even that behind to make sure the family continues running. The mental health issues for women have been enormous. The domestic violence has increased. So it's, again, more than one factor that has made women's life so much more difficult during the pandemic, and also the life of women healthcare workers who've had the caring responsibility at home and the enormous additional pressure in the healthcare system itself. So women have really paid, and are still, we're not at the end of this pandemic, are still paying an enormous price for and within this pandemic.
Yeah. If you allow me, Anke,
yes, of course.
I would like to come back to very specific actions governments can take. And we had the example of France. And when we think about COVID and what it did, as one example, we know that during the pandemic, access to family planning services was interrupted. And that as a consequence, we're facing a lot of unintended pregnancies, which, by the way, has been high even prior to COVID. Again, COVID has highlighted what exists already. But if you think about what are the consequences of unintended pregnancies, when women can not decide freely when they want to have kids, it has really an impact on the education they can get. It has an impact on how they can participate in work life. And again, it has an impact on the economy, on achieving sustainable economic growth, because we kind of not include a very important part of our population in that. So I think these are very specific actions to target these issues governments can take, and they will make a big difference.
And when it comes to economy, normally even men understand that we have a problem. How can maybe be stressed out more that is very much an economic problem that we have there?
I think it's, as Neil said before, that more and more governments have started to prioritize women's health and to look into the specific situation in their country by really starting to listening to women, what their biggest needs are, and developing solutions for that. And I certainly think that this will infect other governments to do the same. And the economic impact and the economic value this provides should be very obvious.
Yes.
Well, we also have to see that most of our societies in this part of the world don't have enough people for the workforce. We are facing an enormous workforce crisis in the health sector in particular, but in many, many other areas. And actually in countries like Germany, Switzerland, Austria, etc., which belong to the more conservative group, if I might say so, we do not have enough women in the workforce. So it's an enormous issue to say, you know, how do we attract women to the workforce? What social policies do we have in place that women can come to the workforce, that they want to come to the workforce, that they are motivated, and that they will stay in the workforce, because that's actually one of the really big issues that, we have this again, particularly in the healthcare sector with nurses, for example, that they come into the workforce with a very high motivation, with very good training. And once they are in the patriarchal system of a hospital, they leave it because the work conditions are so atrocious that if they have any choice, they will choose something else, even if it is staying at home. So we have to look how, you know, the respect for women, the position one gives them, the pay one gives them, has an impact on the whole economy of the country. And that in terms of global competition, if we do not take care and motivate a female workforce, we are going to fall behind significantly.
Yes. Speaking of conservative Germany, we have a new government. Did you have any chance to look at what they are planning to do, and do you have any hopes for a better future for women in Germany? Starting maybe with you, Neil.
Well, I think I'm the only non-German on the panel. So my gaze on Germany is a bit distant, but I mean, what we're seeing from Germany, it sounds positive. We've been hearing things about changing the laws on abortion, fertility policies, contraception. There's a high-level position in the government looking at LGBT rights. So these are all going in the right direction. And I think Germany is a very strong country in Europe. With the new government, I mean, I think they've just barely, you know, been sworn in. I mean, the ministers may not know how to get to their offices yet. We need to give them time. But once they're settled in, if they were to be able to build upon the momentum that France has been creating on women's rights and women's health, we would have a very powerful engine in Europe advancing women's health. I mean, imagine France and Germany teaming up. That's been the traditional motor which has driven forward European progress. Maybe now it's time to take a look at the same Franco-German motor for women's health and women's rights.
Yes, Susie, you look like you have hopes here.
No, I fully agree. It was great to see in the coalition agreement that there is actually something on access to contraceptives and fertility treatment, which is a huge step forward and absolutely in the right direction. And following the example of France would benefit a country like Germany and all over Europe very, very much. If I may just also highlight because we haven't talked about fertility treatments, that's also an area which has a huge economic impact, because many countries, 91 countries worldwide, face a birth rate below 2.1, which is needed to keep the population. And if you have a smaller population, that means that less people in the future to take care of the elderly, a lower tax income, lower participation in the workforce. These are all major economic topics. So providing access to fertility treatments and enabling women to have as many children as they want, and the timing, decide also over the timing, would be a huge economic benefit for any country.
Well, I think the present government needs to face up to the inequalities in the healthcare system. And, it's been on the agenda, the pay of nurses and care workers. It's a thing that a government that comes out of the labor movement, at least one of the parties, should be taking very seriously. It's an issue that a liberal party should take very seriously, and a party that speaks of feminism should take very seriously. So I would hope that the promises that are made in the coalition agreement are fulfilled, both the specific kind of issues we've heard, but also these general labor force issues. They're absolutely critical, and also looking at compensation for unpaid care work. Increasingly, given the older population, women are doing even more unpaid care work, not only towards children, but towards older parents. And we need to find a way how that is balanced out. If it is not paid directly, there's got to be some compensation through pension funds or other things. So it's an enormous agenda, and I would hope that a government that defines itself as progressive will take these issues up as well.
But isn't there also the problem when you pay women for like care work at home? We had that discussion a lot in Germany with the famous Herdprämie to pay women to stay at home. That doesn't that create other problems in women not going to like leadership roles to empower other women, for example?
Well, I think it's a way how you approach the policy. And, many of these women do not only do care work. They have half-time jobs because they have to do the care work. So I think, it's a sign of progressive policy that you sit down together, and we heard it from Susanne, you talk with the people concerned. You have you discuss this through with women. There are, also discussions about general guaranteed income, for example, which would apply for both men and women doing care work, to take one example. It's not something that should be classified by gender. It's something that more women than men happen to do right now because of patriarchal structures. But it is the work that we are paying for, and we're not paying for women to stay at home. And as I said, it might be other mechanisms of exchange in a way. There have been initiatives around that as well, because many women don't have appropriate pension rights either.
Yes. Neil, maybe you have other best practice examples from other countries in Europe. How that gap can be filled?
Yeah, well, in hearing Ilona, I was just thinking of what they do in Sweden with paternal leave, where when a baby is born in a couple, the woman naturally gets maternal leave. But also in the past number of years now in Sweden, the father also gets paid paternal leave, and that leave must be taken. And so what we see now is a whole new generation of fathers in Sweden taking up responsibility for child rearing as well, in a way which is quite commensurate with the women in the family. And that's one area. When we take a look at fertility policies, as Susanne mentioned, what's interesting to see is that fertility, or more specifically demography, with declining populations in many countries around Europe, specifically in Eastern Europe, this has become one of the main issues top of the agenda. And in the European Commission, for the first time ever, we have a commissioner dedicated to demography. And so it's really reached high up. But when we see so the concern is there, populations will decrease 10, 15, 20% over the coming years. But when we take a look at the measures that they're enacting, those same countries with declining populations and demographic concerns are the ones that score the worst when it comes to fertility policies and contraception policies. And in fact, their suggestions for improving demographic performance is to restrict women's rights to access health services. So we see that they're just stuck in a cycle of bad policy making. And we need to find a way of breaking that cycle so that contraception is seen as a way for couples that they can proactively plan a family, and when needed, that they have access to fertility treatments which are affordable and accessible to them.
Yes.
I think in that way, when there's this mismatch between the issues and how they are going to be addressed or lack of being addressed, this role modeling, looking at what other countries are doing, will be very, very important, and learning from each other. I also think country by country, governments really need to start to listen to women and their most pressing needs, healthcare needs and other needs. And then the solutions can be prioritized differently country by country. Also, by the way, the UK is a country which just recently or this spring will launch their women's health strategy for England. So also going in the right direction. And I think the more noise is generated there, the more the link is made to the economic benefit of such measurements, the more countries will certainly follow.
Yes, thank you. I think that is a good conclusion. And you're speaking of learning from each other. I think we learned a lot from each other today. Thank you very much for this great discussion. I at least learned a lot from you. Thank you so much for your time, and have a good day. Thank you for joining us.